August 11, 2000. A 74-year-old man steps off a plane in Budapest, terrified by the camera lights, confused by the crowd, clutching an old Soviet prosthetic leg. He has not spoken to another human being in over 50 years. Not because he was silent, because nobody understood him. His name is Andras Toma, and he is the last prisoner of war from World War II to come home. He was 19 years old when he was captured. He is 74 when he is found. And the reason nobody came looking is because the Soviets declared him dead in 1954. Andras Toma was born on December 5, 1925, in a small Hungarian village called Szülianbakar, near Nyíregyháza in eastern Hungary. A farming family, modest life, no military ambitions. But in 1944, Hungary was fighting alongside Germany, and every able-bodied young man was being pulled into the war. Toma was conscripted at 19. No choice, no training period, just a uniform, a rifle, and orders to march east. By January 1945, the Hungarian and German armies were in full retreat. The Soviet Red Army was pushing west through Poland, crushing everything in its path. Toma was part of a unit somewhere between Auschwitz and Krakow when the Soviets overran their position. He surrendered. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers surrendered that winter. They were disarmed, lined up, and marched into captivity. Most of them thought they would be home within a year. The war was almost over. Germany was collapsing. Surely the Soviets would release the prisoners once the fighting stopped. They were wrong. The Soviets had other plans. Hungarian soldiers, German soldiers, anyone who had fought on the wrong side was sent deep into the Soviet Union. Labor camps, reconstruction projects, punishment. The Red Army needed workers to rebuild the cities that had been destroyed. Prisoners of war were cheap labor, expendable. Toma was loaded onto a cattle car with hundreds of other prisoners and sent east. The journey to the first camp took 21 days. 21 days in a boxcar with no heat, no medical care, and barely any food. The winter of 1945 was brutal. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Men froze to death standing up. Others died from disease, starvation, or injuries sustained during capture. The bodies piled up in the corners of the boxcar. There was nowhere to move them. The living slept on top of the dead just to stay off the frozen floor. Toma survived the journey, but something inside him broke. Witnesses later said he started acting strangely during the transport, muttering to himself, staring at nothing, refusing to speak. Whether it was the cold, the trauma, or the sight of so many corpses, nobody knew. But by the time the train reached its destination, Andras Toma was no longer the same person who had been captured. He was taken to a prisoner of war camp at Boksatogorsk near Leningrad, a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, thousands of prisoners, forced labor, starvation rations, guards who beat anyone who did not work fast enough. Toma was supposed to be processed, documented, and assigned to a work detail. But he was not responding to commands. He was not following orders. The guards thought he was being defiant. The camp doctors thought he was mentally ill. In the spring of 1945, Toma was transferred again, this time to Bistrica, 1,500 kilometers to the east. Another camp. Another set of guards who did not understand what was wrong with him. He was not violent. He was not aggressive. He just could not function. He stared at walls. He muttered in Hungarian. He refused food. The Soviet authorities had a protocol for prisoners like this. If you could not work, you were useless. And if you were mentally unstable, you were sent to a psychiatric hospital. In 1947, Andras Toma was transferred to a psychiatric hospital in Koltenish, 800 kilometers east of Moscow. The diagnosis on his paperwork said psychoneurosis, a vague term that covered everything from shell shock to schizophrenia. The hospital was not a place for treatment. It was a dumping ground. A place where the Soviet system sent people it did not know what to do with. Prisoners who could not work, soldiers who had broken down, civilians who had said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Once you went through the gates of a Soviet psychiatric hospital, you disappeared. And that is exactly what happened to Andras Toma. The moment he was admitted to the hospital, his name was removed from the prisoner of war list. Soviet policy. If you were in a hospital, you were no longer classified as a prisoner of war. You were classified as a patient, and patients were not tracked the same way. The Hungarian government sent lists of missing soldiers to the Soviets after the war. Toma's name was on those lists. But when the Soviets checked their records, they could not find him, because he was not on the prisoner of war list anymore. He was in a hospital under a slightly different name, Andras Tamaz instead of Andras Toma, a clerical error, a small mistake, enough to make him invisible. Hungary declared him dead in 1954, 9 years after the war ended, 9 years of waiting for him to come home. His family assumed he had died in captivity like so many others. They mourned, they moved on, and Andras Toma was forgotten. The hospital in Koltnish was not designed for communication. It was designed for containment. The staff spoke Russian. The patients spoke Russian. Andras Toma spoke Hungarian. Nobody in the hospital spoke Hungarian. Nobody even knew what language he was speaking. To the doctors and nurses, he was just another patient who muttered incomprehensible sounds. They assumed he was mute, or brain damaged, or simply insane. Toma never learned Russian, not in 50 years. This baffled researchers who studied his case after his release. How could someone live in a Russian-speaking environment for 5 decades and not pick up the language? The answer lies in the nature of psychiatric hospitals in the Soviet system. Patients were not encouraged to interact. They were medicated, confined, and left alone. Toma had no reason to learn Russian. He had nobody to talk to, nobody who understood him, nobody who tried. He spent his days in silence. He wandered the halls. He sat in his bed. He stared out windows. The staff described him as withdrawn and unresponsive. He cried often. He coughed. He refused medication. He refused food. He did not sleep at night. When doctors tried to examine him, he would not answer questions. Not because he was being difficult, because he did not understand the questions. The only word he learned in Russian was nekrchi. Do not scream. He said it whenever staff members raised their voices at him. It was the one piece of Russian that penetrated the fog of his isolation. The rest of the language remained incomprehensible. He was trapped in a foreign country, surrounded by people who thought he was insane, with no way to explain who he was or where he came from. He made one friend, a plumber named Gennady. Gennady was an alcoholic who worked at the hospital. He did not speak Hungarian. Toma did not speak Russian. But somehow, over the years, they developed a system of gestures and broken phrases that let them communicate in small ways. Gennady taught Toma how to repair sewage pipes. It was the only skill Toma learned during his entire time in the hospital. The only human connection he had in 53 years. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive. In 1997, a Slovak doctor named Karol Moravchik visited the hospital in Koltnish. He was not there for Toma. He was there for a routine consultation. But as he walked through the wards, he heard something that stopped him cold. A patient was muttering in a language that sounded familiar. Moravchik spoke Hungarian. He recognized the sounds. He approached the patient and spoke to him in Hungarian. The patient looked up. For the first time in over 50 years, Andras Toma heard someone speak his language. Moravchik asked him his name. Toma said Andras. Moravchik asked where he was from. Toma said Hungary. Moravchik asked how long he had been there. Toma did not know. He had lost track of time decades ago. But he knew he was a soldier. He knew he had been captured. He knew he wanted to go home. Moravchik reported what he had found to the hospital administration. The staff was stunned. They had assumed Toma was Russian. They had assumed his muttering was meaningless. Nobody had ever thought to bring in a translator. Nobody had ever questioned why this patient never responded to treatment. He had just been another file in a system that processed thousands of forgotten people. The story reached the Russian press in 2000. A Hungarian prisoner of war, forgotten in a psychiatric hospital for over 50 years, discovered by accident. The Hungarian press picked it up. The Hungarian government sent officials to verify the claim. A neurologist and psychiatrist named András Vejer traveled to Kölnish to examine Toma. Vejer confirmed it. The man was Hungarian. He was coherent. He was not insane. He was just isolated. His mental condition was treatable with medication. And he had been sitting in this hospital since 1947 because nobody had bothered to check. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. On August 11, 2000, András Toma flew home to Hungary. He was 74 years old. He had left as a 19-year-old soldier. He returned as an old man with no family, no memory of modern life, and no understanding of what had happened to the world while he was locked away. The Hungarian government promoted him to reserve sergeant major. Because he had never been officially discharged, his military service was considered continuous. He received 53 years of back pay, several million forints, compensation for a life stolen by bureaucratic neglect. 600 families claimed he was their missing relative. 600 families who had lost someone in the war and hoped this forgotten soldier might be their father, their brother, their son. The Hungarian authorities investigated. They traced Toma's origins to Sulianbacher, his home village. A woman named Anna Gabulia saw the news coverage and recognized his face, the shape of his ears, the back of his neck. She thought he might be her half-brother. DNA tests confirmed it. András Toma had a family. Gabulia and her husband took him in. It was not easy. Toma did not trust them at first. He sat on his bed every morning with his old army cap on his head and his coat pulled tight around his pajamas, refusing to speak, refusing to be touched. When Gabulia tried to comfort him, he told her not to touch him. He asked to leave. He did not understand that he was home. He did not understand that he was safe. He had spent 53 years in an institution. He knew how to survive in a hospital. He did not know how to live in a house. Then a few weeks later something changed. Toma found a broken tool in the garden, a hoe with a splintered handle. He fashioned a new handle from a juniper branch and fixed it. Then he spoke. He said, "Give me your bad tools and I will fix them." It was the first sign that he was beginning to understand where he was. He started working in the garden. He watered flowers. He peeled vegetables. He repaired tools. He talked to Gabulia and her family. He even wrote his full name for the first time, acknowledging who he was. But the scars remained. When asked his name, he sometimes said Ursai, a name he had apparently adopted from a Russian river he crossed, trying to hide his identity from his captors. When asked who shaved him in the hospital, he called the woman who did it the witch with the steel teeth, and said she kicked him in the toilet. When he looked out at the garden, he muttered about Hitler and Horthy, the Hungarian leader who had allied with Nazi Germany. Then he asked for pancakes. His mind moved between the past and the present, unable to fully let go of 53 years of suffering. Let us put this story in context. At the end of World War II, the Soviet Union held approximately 3 million prisoners of war. German, Hungarian, Romanian, Italian, Finnish, and Japanese soldiers. Most were released between 1945 and 1950, but hundreds of thousands were not. They were held longer, used for forced labor, sent to camps in Siberia, worked to death, or, like Toma, lost in the bureaucracy. Hungary lost 600,000 people during World War II. Soldiers, civilians, Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Of those, 70,000 Hungarian soldiers were captured by the Soviets. 50,000 returned home by 1950. The remaining 20,000 either died in captivity or, like Toma, disappeared into the Soviet system. Families searched for missing soldiers for years, decades. Most never got answers. Toma was one of the lucky ones. He was found. He came home, but he came home 55 years too late. The psychiatric hospital in Koltenish held thousands of patients over the decades. Most were Soviet citizens, political prisoners, dissidents, people who had said the wrong thing or been in the wrong place. But there were others, foreign prisoners, displaced persons, people who had fallen through the cracks of the post-war chaos. Nobody knows how many. Records were not kept, or if they were kept, they were buried in archives that have never been opened. Toma was discovered by accident. How many others were never discovered at all? Andras Toma lived with his sister for 4 years after his return. He adjusted to life in Hungary. He met relatives he had never known. He visited his old school. He met classmates who were still alive. They were old now like him, but they remembered him as a boy. They told him stories about who he had been before the war. He listened. He smiled. He sang the Hungarian national anthem on camera, proving that even after 53 years, he had not forgotten his country. He received a lighter prosthetic leg to replace the heavy Soviet one. The new leg was 1.5 kilograms lighter. It made walking easier. He received treatment for his mental illness. Doctors confirmed that his condition was manageable with medication. He was not insane. He had never been insane. He had been traumatized, isolated, abandoned, but his mind was intact. The Hungarian government paid him his back salary. His family was not satisfied with the compensation. They argued that 53 years of wrongful detention deserved more than a few million forints and a promotion. But the case was complicated. Toma had been held by the Soviet Union, not Hungary, and the Soviet Union no longer existed. Who was responsible? The Russian government said it was not their fault. It was a Soviet-era mistake. The Hungarian government said they had tried to find him, but the Soviets had removed him from the lists. The bureaucracy that had trapped him for 53 years was the same bureaucracy that made it impossible to hold anyone accountable. Andras Toma died on March 30th, 2004 at the age of 78. He had been home for less than 4 years. His sister, Anna, took care of him until the end. A memorial was erected in his honor. At the dedication, veterans sang the Hungarian anthem. The same anthem Toma had sung after his return, proving that some things could not be erased, even by 53 years of silence. The story of Andras Toma is not just about one forgotten soldier. It is about the machinery of war and what happens when that machinery does not stop. World War II ended in 1945. The fighting stopped. The treaties were signed. The borders were redrawn, but the consequences kept going. Prisoners of war were supposed to be released. Families were supposed to be reunited. The world was supposed to move on. But for millions of people, the war never ended. It just changed shape. Toma was not tortured. He was not executed. He was not worked to death in a labor camp. He was simply forgotten. A clerical error. A name removed from a list. A language barrier that nobody bothered to solve. And because of that, he spent 53 years in a psychiatric hospital, unable to communicate, unable to leave, unable to convince anyone that he did not belong there. He was not a victim of cruelty. He was a victim of indifference. And in some ways, that is worse. The Soviet Union processed millions of prisoners after the war. Most were documented. Most were released. But the system was not designed for accuracy. It was designed for speed. And in a system that processed millions, individuals disappeared. Toma was one. How many others were there? How many soldiers, how many civilians, how many people were lost in the bureaucracy and never found? We do not know. We will never know. The records are incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the archives were sealed or destroyed. What makes Toma's story remarkable is not just that he was forgotten. It is that he was found. If not for a Slovak doctor who happened to visit the hospital in 1997, Toma would have died there. He would have been buried in an unmarked grave in Russia. His family would never have known what happened to him. He would have been just another name on a list of missing soldiers, just another casualty of a war that refused to end. Andras Toma is believed to be the last prisoner of war from World War II to be repatriated. The last man to come home, 55 years after the war ended, 53 years after he was declared dead, 4 years before his actual death. The gap between those numbers tells the whole story. A war that lasted 6 years, a captivity that lasted 55, a homecoming that lasted 4. The Hungarian government called his return a miracle. The press called it a tragedy. Both were right. It was a miracle that he was found. It was a tragedy that he was lost in the first place. It was a miracle that he survived. It was a tragedy that he spent most of his life in silence. It was a miracle that he had a family to come home to. It was a tragedy that he had so little time with them. Toma himself did not speak much about what it felt like to be forgotten. He did not give long interviews. He did not write a memoir. He just lived. He fixed tools. He watered flowers. He ate pancakes at noon. He sang the anthem when asked. He did the small things that make a life, trying to make up for 53 years when he could not do any of those things. His story forces uncomfortable questions. How many prisoners are still missing? How many families are still waiting? How many bureaucratic errors have not been corrected? The end of a war does not mean the end of suffering. It just means the suffering becomes invisible. And for Andras Toma, that suffering lasted longer than the war itself.